Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are and when you're listening to this. My name is Michiko Wolcott. I am the principal consultant at AMAA Analytics. I work with organizations on data and analytics on pretty much every topic except actually doing the analytics. The Ask Me Almost Anything sessions is really a series of 30-minute, relatively informal Q&A sessions on various non-technical topics about data and analytics, somewhat motivated by the COVID-19 situation. So a little bit of housekeeping. The session will be 30 minutes. Please keep video off. You are all muted and won't be able to unmute yourself just to make it easier for me to run a one-person show. And if you have any questions that you would like addressed, please enter them in the chat box. They will come directly to me and I will do my best to address them in the time we have. This session is being recorded so that the people who have registered will get a link to the recording. Today's session is titled Roles and Responsibilities in the Enterprise Analytics Value Stream. It is the third of the series intended for technical leaders of analytics, statistics, and data science, current and future. If you missed the previous sessions, the recordings are available at the AMAA Analytics YouTube channel. This is an introductory overview, and so we won't get into specifics because the specifics will vary for each situation, but I hope this helps you reframe the bigger problems you're facing every day, like analytical culture and collaboration. This is not for any specific markets or sectors, and my experience across many countries has really told me that this is universal because we are all humans. By the way, I use the term analytics, statistics, and data science quite interchangeably, and in fact, I say analytics most of the time just to keep things simple. So let's get started. We started the series talking about the value of analytics and its importance to us as analytics professionals, especially in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. We really need to focus on producing value to the business or to the client and avoid being a pure expense if we want to survive. That was the message that was getting passed on to us. So then we talked about the enterprise process framework designed to produce that value. That the scope of these processes is enterprise or the environment, which can actually go beyond the entire organization. And this is not a business unit thing, but something much bigger than that. And it applies to all kinds of industries, including public sectors. That there are generally four functions or functional areas in this process framework: the analytics function, the data function, the technology, and the business functions. That the analytical maturity or the analytical culture of an environment has a lot to do with who is creating the impetus at which step of the process, and how that creates misaligned expectations in the minds of analytics professionals. So thoughts like, we want them to involve us earlier, is really an expression of these misaligned expectations. And that analytics and innovation have a lot in common. So the chances are that if you see certain tendencies for one in an organization, you probably see the same tendencies for the other. We also address that the analytics leaders are not necessarily responsible for doing or building this, but it is up to you to orchestrate the total solution as the owner of analytics, and that the total solution includes everything around analytics, not just doing analytics. So one of the questions I get a lot is about the roles and responsibilities with respect to data and analytics. So today, we'll address what these roles are, the key reasons for the confusion among these roles, and some of the foundational ideas for resolving these confusions. You can see the reference to the 4 functions here in the enterprise process framework. From the business leaders, this question is, well, what roles and responsibilities do I need to implement to have analytics in my organization or in my environment? And from the analytics and technology leaders, the question's a little bit more specific. How do you reconcile the confusion between these roles? The latter actually is paraphrased quite a bit here. But the business thinks, ooh, analytics, let me hire a data scientist. While the analytics and technology professionals are in conflict either about where the boundaries are between them. So we see this reflected in various interpretation of what a data scientist is, for example, or in conflict from the lack of mutual understanding. So the technology function may not understand how analytics is actually done, or the analytics people might feel that the software developers reduce data science to a programming exercise, or the analytics people don't understand why technology doesn't allow us to do certain things, such and such, when it's so easy to do, et cetera, et cetera. And so we have all these questions, or let's say, quote unquote, complaints that we face on a daily basis. Now, to get more into the roles and responsibilities, we go back to the idea of the value of analytics. And to do that, we look at the enterprise information value stream. Now, we don't normally think of information as something to be consumed, but that we don't often creates this gap. And the barrier between the steps in the process that we saw, and there's a little picture over here, which that creates a gap, and that often leads to the notorious unmet business expectations. Now, for practical purposes, it's useful to compare the information enterprise process to a cookie bakery or a manufacturer. So in the cookie world, we have ingredients which are transformed according to the recipes, which using the appliances in the environment, oh, there we go, appliances in the environment to produce the cookies, which we, the consumers, buy and eat. So the ingredients are the raw materials, obviously. The recipes are really specs, specifications, the logic on how to best combine and integrate the raw materials and transform them into something consumable. The appliances and the environment are the tools and the infrastructure to store, to transform, integrate, and transport the ingredients, as well as the consumable produced by the recipes. And the cookies, obviously, are the products, the consumable, the ultimate consumable. So each of these ideas hints at a different function, but all contributing towards the consumption of the cookies. In other words, each function adds specific values toward the consumption of the cookies, which is the part that's most important. Now, it is important to recognize that consumable doesn't mean consumed. Now, getting back to the idea of the value, to us as consumers, cookies have values that are tangible and intangible. So the price we pay for them is a tangible value, and that you become less hungry, so that is also a tangible value. Although you could argue that some cookies are so good, it just makes you more hungry. The experience of eating a fabulous cookie is an intangible value. So try to remember the time when you had the best chocolate chip cookie ever. Now, here it's important to understand that the value of the recipe is just one component of the value of the cookies. That is, to have highly valuable cookies that everyone in the world wants to buy and eat. We have to have good ingredients. We have to have a good recipe, good appliances in the kitchen, and the cookies need to be delivered before they become stale. And with each of these aspects aligned with the value to the consumer to produce the cookies that we all want to eat. You mess one of these steps up, and the cookies become undesirable and lose value. Now, the same applies for the consumption of insights, that is, using an analytic to make a business or research decision. So in the information world, which is on the right side, we have the data, the raw materials, which are transformed according to the model or the results of the model, results of the analysis, developed using analytical approaches and methodologies that become the recipes on how to best combine and interpret the data. Now, using the technology, the tools, and the infrastructures to store, transform, integrate, and transfer to produce the insights, which are the products, that is, the consumables. And the business value is realized when the business consumes these insight cookies. And each of these represents a different aspect and contribution towards the consumption of the insights. That means each component adds different values towards the overall goal of insight consumption. And this implies that the expertise expected for each function is different from the expertise expected from the other functions. Then the roles and responsibilities along in the information space have to be defined to support this value stream. So the data function is responsible for the raw materials. That is, they own everything content of the data itself. The analytics function owns the development of the recipes using the analytical mechanics that we've mentioned in previous sessions. That is, the how to best make use of them. The technology function owns everything that has to do with the strategy and the management of the technology environment and tools. So that includes the architecture, the network, the hardware and software, etc. And the consumer function is the business that consumes the insights. Now, we're calling this a value chain or value stream and not a supply chain. This is a very important distinction. This is actually a question I got some time ago from a professor whose research is focused on analytical culture in an organization. And the distinction here is not trivial between the value chain versus supply chain. Now, the reason is that our objective really is to provide value rather than simply passing on the insights. We want them to make use out of it. We want to create value out of what we do. As we have seen, just producing and making insights, making them available and accessible isn't sufficient to produce value. And because of this, a concept of consumption by the business is fundamental. That is, our interest is in the consumed and not simply creating the consumables. And what converts a consumable to be consumed is that the value produced aligns with the value desired by the customer, consumer, or the business. This is your classic supply and demand. We don't always think of we don't normally think of analytics in context as a product in the context of supply and demand, but that's basically what this is. Now, a common challenge in practice today is a confusion between these functions. So you have cases where the technology function is responsible for data, the content, the raw materials, or you have the cases where the analytics function is responsible for data, or you have the technology function is developing analytics, responsible for developing analytics, or In some organizations, the people will even say something like, well, data is owned by everybody in the organization. Well, while the intent of this is noble, this just creates a massive confusion to the average employee, and people want to know where the buck stops. So it's important to have this kind of ownership type concept. But going back to the cookie analogy, no one confuses the expertise in ovens, the appliance, with expertise in butter, the ingredient, although butter is typically stored in a refrigerator. Or no one thinks that the engineers that design a kitchen mixer, the appliance, are experts in developing cookie recipes. Or that the recipe developers are experts in growing and processing wheat, the ingredient. Yes, it's important for the engineer to understand how the appliances or tools are going to be used so that he or she has to have some knowledge so that he or she can make the product of what he does better. But that doesn't make him or her an expert or even responsible in, say, managing and understanding butter. But this happens all the time with data. So as a result, the data generally suffers, and it generally suffers the most neglect. This is essentially because data really aren't really sexy in the same way that most people don't think of flour as something really sexy in cookie making. And why is that? Well, it's a lot more difficult to attribute a tangible value to data from the business perspective, as just like it is much more difficult to attribute tangible value to growing wheat from the perspective of a consumer. Yes, we all say garbage in, garbage out, but when was the last time we quantified the value of this garbage? Unfortunately, very little happens if you can't put a value to it. Now, that doesn't mean that it is definitely getting paid attention if you do put a value on something, but if you don't, you really don't stand a chance. So one of the causes for this confusion between the roles has to do with the fact that these roles have a lot of hard skills in common. So generally for each of these functions, you pretty much have to have some programming or scripting skills. You have to have some data analysis skills. And you have to have some knowledge of the technology like tools and the hardware and software and others. So then what are the differences? It's the objectives of each role. With that come different focuses and skills, different focus and knowledge, different focus and strategy. And all that, although we might all have kind of similar skill sets. So the objectives and the responsibilities of each role have to be clearly defined for this to work. In other words, the differences have to do with the ownership and the focus of each of these roles, and not as much to do with specific skill sets and knowledge as we are commonly led to believe. So then we have a challenge here. You have to be able to clearly articulate these conceptual differences, and to be able to do so, you have to have a good grasp of the nature of these functions. The problem is compounded by the fact that it is so much easier to describe functions and positions in terms of skills, tools, and mechanics, but those are not what really define them. Unfortunately, skills, tools, and mechanics are much cleaner, more concrete, and more tangible, so everybody goes there. It's human nature to gravitate towards things that require the least amount of thought, even if you don't intend to do so. And this is a pretty well understood human behavior or tendency. This also implies that a position description based purely on techniques, tools, and skills is not adequate. And because of all this, there is a lot of confusion, not just on the business side, but also among ourselves. We have to emphasize the objectives of the function and those objectives defined along the value stream. To complicate the matter even further, there is a very common confusion among the concepts of custody, execution, and ownership when it comes to data. So often, technology has the custody of the data because the technology infrastructure generates and houses data. So they must be the data owner, right? Well, I often talk to the technology leaders who are designated enterprise data owners. That's how they've been defined. And I explain some of these concepts. Invariably, they respond that everybody assumed that data was responsibility of technology just by default. So the vast majority of them say that they don't even want that ownership, but it was something that they ended up inheriting by default. Or also, almost just as often, analytics people are the ones who work with the data the most and therefore know the data best. So we must be the data owner, right? Well, here's where I want to emphasize that the execution and custody are separate from who owns the strategy and who makes the final decisions throughout the entire life cycle of data. Essentially, where the buck stops when it comes to data and data as a raw ingredient. So it's funny, whenever I mention the term life cycle with respect to data, I get really funny looks. The term life cycle, I guess, implies that the thing dies at some point. And often people don't think of data as something that die. Well, this alone, I think, is a good reason why we need a dedicated owner of everything data who is different from the owners of the technology and of analytics, and make sure they die a proper death, if nothing else. Now, today, it's not that uncommon to have the role of Chief Data Officer or CDO as an enterprise. That said, in many cases, not all, but in a good number of cases, the objectives of the CDO are still pretty limited, with the ownership of the data governance with a limited scope like security and compliance. And sometimes they'll look after quality. But in these cases, the data office is often a lot more tactical than strategic. And we will see in a future session how the role of the CDO and how the role of data office needs to be a lot more than that. One comment on the concept of the CDAO. There are many organizations that have a chief data and analytics officer as a single owner of both data and analytics rather than two separate owners. Now, on the surface, this sort of makes sense because they're so tightly related that it seems like a good idea to have one role that owns both. But this is actually pretty tricky to make it work. Now, personally, I don't recommend this as a default, except for very specific reasons or situations. Like, for example, your organization is too small to have two separate owners. Now, although it makes sense that we want the data and analytics as an integral function, at least from what I have seen in my experience, it hasn't worked out as intended in a lot of cases. And the reason, again, remember that flour just isn't as sexy as recipe development. And it's much easier to associate tangible business value to the analytic than to the raw materials. So as a result, we just pay more attention to analytics than to data. And this really isn't intentional in most cases. We're still human, and we just pay more attention to the things we like or things we find interesting. So you have to implement a very strong and deliberate countermeasure if you have a single office for both data and analytics, or the data side is going to suffer. Now, we, the analytics professionals, also have to take a step back here. Now, we might think, well, we're analytics people and we work with data and therefore we know data, right? But the analytics people are not the experts, generally speaking, on the entire provenance of data. We just have more visibility starting at a very particular point. Now, to use a statistical term, our understanding of the data is entirely left censored. We don't know about growing data, like an agriculture expert might know about growing wheat. We don't spend nearly enough mind share on data strategy, like trading specialists understand commodity pricing of wheat, or like buyers understand wheat sourcing strategy. Because we have better things to do, like developing the analytic, right? That's more interesting to us and we have better things to do. So just because we work with data doesn't mean that we should be data owners. Now, under the present scenario, we may be the ones who know the most, but that doesn't mean that we should own it. Again, execution is not ownership. And too often, we maybe give ourselves a little too much credit here, although without meaning to do so, and perhaps to the detriment of the end value being generated. The point is that in the enterprise, somebody has to own everything data as an ingredient. Now, we often hear the term data as a strategic asset, but rarely are the roles and the responsibilities defined to really, truly reflect that. Now, this is needed to support the information value stream here, shown here. From the acquisition, the generation or curation, the accumulation, the transfer, the integration, the storage, and all the way up to use, management, and sunsetting on topics like pricing, contracts and regulations, risks, management and administration, quality, strategy, and even ethics. Having said all this, keep in mind that this is not for the purpose of saying, well, okay, I'm an analytics person, therefore this is not my responsibility. Data is not my responsibility. Technology is not my responsibility. That's not the point. As analytics leaders, we have to lead toward a better total solution for analytics, not just the analytical mechanics part. Now, we all like to say that we are problem solvers. So are we willing to solve this problem? Now, we are coming up on the 30-minute mark. In fact, I believe we are pretty much at the 30-minute mark. So I will look to respond to the remaining questions in future sessions. Please do send me any follow-up questions. Please also send your thoughts regarding non-technical topics you'd like to see covered that I might be able to address. Please also give me a follow on LinkedIn, Twitter, website, and next session will be in a week, same time, same place, on a topic to be determined. And the people who have registered will receive an email with a recording, link to the recording, and I'll send an announcement regarding next week via LinkedIn, Twitter, my website, and a few email lists. Now, thank you for your time. Have a great rest of the day, and hope to see you back next week.